My daughter-in-law looked at me across that restaurant table, smiled the way people smile when they want to be cruel without looking like it, and said, "Honestly, Mum, this isn't really your kind of place, is it?" Then my son Timothy nodded. Just barely, just enough, and asked the waiter to find me somewhere quieter to sit. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I reached into my coat pocket, found the card I'd been carrying for 11 months, and excused myself to make one phone call. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. I live in a small brick house on the edge of Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knows which porch light stays on all night and which family got a new dog last spring. My husband Bernard passed 6 years ago, and after that the house became both smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because his laughter used to fill every room. Larger because silence has a way of expanding to fit whatever space it's given. Most mornings I wake before 7. I make tea in the pot Bernard bought me from a little shop in Lunenburg the summer before he got sick. The handle has a hairline crack now that I've wrapped in electrical tape rather than replace. People sometimes think that's eccentric. It isn't. It just means I understand that cracked things still hold warmth if you're careful with them. After Bernard died, I found a routine that kept me steady. Tuesday mornings at the seniors literacy program. Thursday afternoons volunteering at the food bank on Windmill Road. Saturdays at St. Andrews. My son Timothy used to call every Sunday evening, right after supper. Then it became every other Sunday. Then once a month. Then birthdays and Christmas. And even those calls felt like something he was checking off a list. Still, when he called this past February, actually called, not just texted a photo of the grandchildren, my heart did what it always does. It forgot every unanswered message. It simply lifted. "Mum!" he said. There was noise behind him. Traffic, or a restaurant kitchen, or the general hum of a life that had very little room for me in it. "I want you to come to Toronto for the weekend." End of March. We're having a dinner. Clients, some colleagues. Nadine wants the family there. Nadine is my daughter-in-law, Timothy's wife of 9 years. She's always been pleasant to me in the particular way that people are pleasant to furniture they'd prefer to replace. Polite, but never quite looking directly at it. I almost asked why. Almost. But lonely people learn quickly not to examine invitations too closely, in case the invitation disappears under scrutiny. "I'd love that," I said. "Of course I'd love that." "Dress up a bit," Timothy added quickly. "It's a nice place." I told him I would. And after we hung up, I sat in Bernard's chair with my tea going cold and cried a little. Happy tears, I told myself. My boy was inviting me somewhere. I have one good dress. Sage green, bought for Timothy and Nadine's wedding, and worn 4 times since. The waist needed letting out slightly. I'd put on a few pounds and wasn't sorry about it. So I took it to the little tailor on Portland Street who'd done work for me before. I also resoled my good shoes, the dark ones with the modest heel. I polished my grandmother's pearl brooch. I went to the salon on Wise Road, the one run by a young woman named Keisha, who showed me photographs of modern styles on her phone while I asked, very politely, for something simple. "I just want to look like myself," I told her. "Only neater." Keisha laughed warmly and said she understood. That was a kindness I didn't forget. About a week before I was meant to leave, my granddaughter Poppy called me. She's 9. She calls without prompting, which already makes her exceptional. "Gran," she said. "Dad says you're coming to the big dinner." "I am. Are you excited to see me?" "Yes," she said. Then, quieter. "Gran, can I tell you something?" "Always." A pause. The kind children make when they're deciding whether a grown-up can be trusted. "Mummy was on the phone with Aunt Becca last night. She said she didn't know how to explain you to the clients." My hand tightened around the phone. "Explain me how." But before Poppy could answer, I heard Nadine's voice in the background, firm and cheerful in the way that means the conversation is over. The line disconnected a moment later. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that. The electric kettle clicked off. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked at something. I thought about calling Timothy and canceling. Told myself I was being foolish. Told myself Poppy had misunderstood. Told myself that children hear fragments and build fears from them. I got on the bus to Toronto anyway. It was raining when I arrived. The terminal smelled of wet wool and coffee. I took a taxi to the restaurant, and when I said the name to the driver, he raised his eyebrows slightly. "Nice place," he said. It was more than nice. The entrance was all glass and stone, with a canopy of hanging lights that made everything look like the inside of a jewelry box. A young woman at the front desk wore her hair in a precise bun and smiled at me with the kind of professional warmth that stops just before the eyes. She confirmed the reservation and guided me through the dining room, which was full of the particular quietness that only expensive places achieve. The murmur of important conversations, the soft click of cutlery that costs more per setting than my weekly grocery budget. Timothy was already there, standing near the back of a private room. He looked handsome. He looked like Bernard sometimes, around the eyes, and it still catches me off guard when I notice it. He was laughing at something a man in a charcoal suit was saying, and for one unguarded moment, before he saw me, I felt pure pride. That's my boy, I thought. My boy who used to build forts from couch cushions and cry when we had to put the cat down. Then he saw me, and the laugh changed. Not gone. Timothy is too practiced for that, but shifted, rearranged into something more controlled. "Mum." He gave me a brief sideways hug, the kind that touches shoulders but not hearts. "You made it." "Good." Nadine appeared beside him. She was wearing a burgundy dress that likely cost more than my television. Her hair was perfect. Her smile took just a fraction too long to arrive. "Evelyn," she said. She always calls me Evelyn, never Mum, which I understand but which has always felt like a small, regular correction. "Nadine, you look lovely." "Thank you." Her eyes moved across my dress, my brooch, my resoled shoes. "Not obviously." Nadine would never be obvious. But I am 64 years old, and I have been noticing how women look at each other for 60 of those years. The table was long and gleaming. There were 8 clients and colleagues already seated, plus Timothy's business partner, a man named Fletcher Osey, who'd built their consulting firm from the ground up alongside Timothy. Fletcher shook my hand warmly and held it an extra moment. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "My surname. Tim talks about you. Good things, I hopes." He smiled. "Absolutely." Timothy guided me to a seat near the middle of the table, between a woman named Diane who worked in commercial real estate and an older gentleman whose name I didn't catch. The conversation flowed easily enough around me. Project timelines, a development in Calgary, property valuations in Mississauga. I listened more than I spoke, which I've learned to do at events where I'm not entirely sure why I've been invited. At one point, Diane leaned toward me with genuine friendliness. "So, Evelyn, what keeps you busy?" I started to answer, the literacy program, the food bank, the church, but Nadine from 3 seats away cut smoothly across me. "Evelyn is retired," she said pleasantly. "She's very involved in her community back in Nova Scotia." Not wrong, but not what I was saying either. And somehow, very involved in her community, managed to make 64 years of a full life sound like a hobby. I picked up my water glass and took a sip and said nothing. As the main course arrived, I noticed that Timothy kept glancing at me the way you glance at a stain you're hoping no one else has noticed. He redirected every conversation that veered toward my childhood, my work history, the years I'd spent as the bookkeeper for Bernard's small electrical contracting business. Once, when I mentioned that we'd lived in a rented duplex until Timothy was 11, he laughed in a particular way and said, "Mum loves to tell that story." And the table laughed politely and moved on. I didn't think I'd been telling a story. I thought I'd been answering a question. The evening continued. Wine was poured, around me, mostly, though the waiter eventually thought to offer me a glass. I asked for red. Timothy said, mildly but clearly, "Mum doesn't drink at dinner," which was so blatantly untrue that for a moment I simply stared at him. "I do drink at dinner. I've been drinking half a glass of Shiraz with dinner since 1987. "I'd love a glass, actually," I said to the waiter, with a smile I kept steady. Timothy looked at the tablecloth. It was near the end of the main course that things shifted. A woman at the far end of the table, sharp-eyed, silver-haired, who'd been introduced as someone important in hotel development, though I'd already lost track of surnames, said something that made the table laugh. In the laughter, I reached for my napkin, and my elbow caught my water glass. It tipped, not dramatically, not a flood, but enough that water spread quickly across the white tablecloth toward the nearest place settings. "Oh, goodness. I'm so sorry." I was already reaching to right the glass. already taking my napkin to the puddle. A waiter appeared as in seconds, kind, efficient. Not at all, ma'am. It happens. But Timothy had gone rigid. He pressed his lips together in the way Bernard used to call his lockjaw look, the expression he'd worn since childhood when something embarrassed him. He said nothing at the moment. The waiter managed the spillage with quiet competence. Conversation resumed. Then, about 10 minutes later, when the silver-haired woman had turned away and the table's attention was elsewhere, Timothy leaned toward me and said under his breath, "Mum, do you think maybe you'd be more comfortable at the bar?" I looked at him. "At the bar, it's quieter. You could have your wine without." He gestured vaguely at the table. "Without what?" He looked at me with something that wasn't quite cruelty, which somehow made it worse. It was dismissal dressed as consideration. "This is a work dinner. These people are important." And there it was. 11 words. These people are important. The implication sitting perfectly clear underneath. And you are not. "I see," I said quietly. "It's just." He lowered his voice further. "You knocked over a glass, Mum, in front of Duplantis." He nodded toward the silver-haired woman. "She's deciding whether to bring us a $30 million contract." I apologized immediately. The waiter said, "It's not just the glass." He exhaled. His voice stayed low, stayed controlled. "You're not really. This isn't your world, Mum. You'd be more comfortable somewhere else. And honestly, it would make things easier for everyone." Easier for everyone. I sat with that sentence for a moment. I looked around the table at these important people, at my son's careful face, at Nadine, who was very studiously not looking at us. I looked at the sage green dress I'd had for 9 years, and the shoes I'd resoled, and the brooch that had belonged to my mother. Then I placed my napkin on the table, took my wine glass. I kept the wine, and excused myself quietly. "Just going to find the ladies' room," I said pleasantly to no one and everyone. But I didn't go to the ladies' room. I went to a small seating area near the restaurant's entrance, sat in an armchair beside a potted tree, and took out my phone. I found the contact under the name Hugh Emberton. I'd been carrying it, as I said, for 11 months. Hugh Emberton had been Bernard's oldest friend. They'd met in the Army Reserves at 19 and spent 50 years being the kind of friends who could go 18 months without speaking and then pick up exactly where they'd left off. When Bernard was dying, Hugh had sat with him 3 nights in a row in that hospital room on the 5th floor. He held Bernard's hand when I couldn't anymore, because my own hands were shaking too badly. After Bernard died, Hugh had come to see me one afternoon, 6 weeks later. He'd brought a folder. Inside were documents I hadn't known existed, because Bernard, who was careful and quiet in all the ways that masks are, had been thoughtful about the future, in ways he'd never burdened me with while he was alive. "He didn't want you to worry while he was here," Hugh told me. "He wanted you to know only when you needed to." What I learned that afternoon, in my small living room in Dartmouth with Hugh's hands folded carefully over his knee, was this: Bernard had been quietly investing for 30 years. Not dramatically, not aggressively. He wasn't a gambler or a speculator. He'd simply put money, consistently and carefully, into things he understood: real estate trusts, a silent partnership in a small chain of hardware stores in Atlantic Canada, and, as of 15 years ago, a hospitality development fund that had grown very quietly into something substantial. How substantial? I'd asked. Hugh had shown me a number. I'd had to put down my tea. I hadn't told Timothy, not because I was hiding it from him. Or perhaps I was, a little, but not out of spite. Because Bernard and I had talked in those last weeks about Timothy, about the way success had begun to change him, about the careful distance he kept from anything that reminded him of where he'd started. "He's ashamed of us," Bernard said once, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Then, "Not of us, of who we were, of what we didn't have." I had told Bernard that wasn't true, but I wasn't entirely certain. Hugh had set up a legal structure. Everything managed through a trust under my name. I was instructed at any point to call Hugh if I felt it was time. "You'll know when," was all Bernard had said apparently, when he gave Hugh those instructions. Sitting in that armchair beside the potted tree with my wine glass in my free hand, I dialed Hugh's number. He answered on the second ring. "Evelyn." His voice was steady and warm. He was 81 years old and had the vocal tone of a man who had never once been flustered. "Hugh," I said, "I think it's time." A pause. Just brief. Then, are you all right? I thought about how to answer that. I've been moved to the lobby, I said, because I spilled some water. Another pause. I see. His voice shifted slightly, not angry but resolved. I'll make some calls. What's the name of the restaurant? I told him. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then Hugh said, Evelyn. I know that restaurant. Do you? The Emberton Group acquired it 14 months ago. I looked up at the ceiling of the restaurant I was, apparently in some roundabout way, sitting inside of. Well, I said. Give me 20 minutes, said Hugh. I finished my wine. I ordered another from a passing waiter, who brought it without comment, and with a small respectful nod that I thought nothing of at the time. I sat in my armchair beside my potted tree, and I thought about Bernard. About the way he used to hum while he made toast on Sunday mornings. About the way he would always, without being asked, reach for my hand during films. About the last thing he said to me, which I have never told anyone and do not intend to. 17 minutes later, the front doors of the restaurant opened, and a man in his mid-50s entered wearing a dark overcoat and carrying himself with the particular posture of someone who owns things. His name, I would learn momentarily, was Roland Strickland, and he was the regional director of operations for the Emberton Group, which is to say Hugh's company, which is to say my trust's primary asset. He spoke briefly to the host. The host pointed toward me. Roland crossed the lobby, stopped in front of my armchair, and said with a kind of careful, measured formality, Mrs. Bernard Calloway? Yes. He straightened almost imperceptibly. I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were here this evening, Mr. Emberton called ahead. May I ask, is everything all right? Not entirely, I said. His expression changed. I see. Please. Is there anything I can do? You could tell me, I said mildly, whether the private dining room I was asked to leave is fully booked this evening, or whether there might be a more appropriate arrangement. Roland Strickland looked briefly toward the hallway that led to the private rooms, then back at me. There's an owner's suite on the upper level, he said carefully. It isn't booked this evening. That's kind of you, I said. I followed him toward the staircase. As we passed the entrance to the private dining room, the glass wall that separated it from the corridor made it easy to see inside. Timothy was still talking, hands moving, confident, every inch the successful consultant. Nadine was laughing at something one of the clients said. Fletcher caught my eye through the glass and frowned with a puzzled concern. I kept walking. The upper room was quiet and warm. A long table, soft lighting, a window that looked out over the street below where the March rain was still coming down. Roland seated me at one end of the table and left someone to see to whatever I needed. About 10 minutes later, the door opened and Hugh Emberton walked in. He looked exactly as he always does. White hair. A dark suit that fits him the way suits fit men who've been wearing them for 50 years. He kissed the top of my head, as he has done since Bernard died, and sat across from me and took my hands in his for a moment without saying anything. He'd have hated this evening, I said. He would have said something extremely impolite to your son and pretended it was an accident, said Hugh. I laughed, which surprised me. Hugh opened the leather portfolio he'd set on the table. He laid out several pages quietly. The trust structure is solid. Nothing has changed. You're still the controlling interest. The question is what you want to do. I don't want to punish him, I said immediately. Hugh looked at me. That's not actually on the table, Evelyn. But disclosure is. I looked at the papers. All those carefully arranged numbers that Bernard had built over 30 years in the particular quiet way, he did everything. Without performance. Without expectation of acknowledgement. Just because it was the right thing to be doing. He's going to be humiliated, I said. Yes, he's going to feel exactly the way he made me feel tonight. Hugh said nothing. He understood that I wasn't looking for an answer. I thought about Timothy at 7 years old, falling off his bicycle on the gravel drive and refusing to cry until he thought no one was watching. I thought about Timothy, at 14, buying me a card for Mother's Day with money he'd earned, delivering flyers, because he'd spent his allowance on something else and hadn't wanted to ask Bernard for more. I thought about Timothy at Bernard's funeral, standing rigid as a post, shaking every hand, not crying until he thought everyone had left. And then discovering I hadn't left, that I was still sitting in the second row, and how his face had simply collapsed. I thought about, these people are important. All right, I said. Bring him up. Hugh left the room briefly. I heard, through the floor, the particular kind of restaurant noise that includes someone being surprised. Timothy came through the door 8 minutes later. Nadine was with him, and Fletcher, who had apparently insisted on joining, which told me something about Fletcher Ossie that I had already suspected. Timothy looked confused and wary. Nadine looked the way she does when she suspects she's made a social error but can't quite locate it yet. Then Timothy saw Hugh. "Mr. Emberton," he said slowly. He'd met Hugh a few times over the years at Bernard's side. He knew who Hugh was. "What's going on?" Hugh sat down calmly. "Timothy, why don't you sit down?" "I'd rather Timothy," my voice, quiet. He looked at me then, and something in my face made him sit. Hugh laid the papers on the table clearly, professionally, without drama. He explained the trust. He explained the investments. He explained the Emberton Group and its subsidiaries, one of which was the restaurant they were currently sitting inside of. He explained, carefully and without haste, exactly what my name was connected to. The private dining room downstairs. The $30 million contract Timothy was courting. The table Timothy had asked me to leave. My son went pale in a way I had never seen before. Not embarrassed pale, shattered pale. The kind that comes from the ground shifting under the story you've been telling about yourself. "That's not possible," he said. "It's well documented," said Hugh. "Dad was." Timothy looked at me. "Dad was a small contractor." "Your father," said Hugh, "was a very deliberate man." Nadine had not spoken since sitting down. She was staring at the papers on the table with an expression I couldn't immediately name. Then I recognized it. It was the expression of someone reassessing every assumption they've made and not liking the results. Fletcher, beside her, said nothing, but his eyes were steady on Timothy, and they weren't kind. Timothy said, finally, "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about how to answer. "Because your father wanted you to believe in yourself," I said. "Not in us. That's not." He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "I've spent 15 years telling people I built my business from nothing." "You did build it," I said. "Nobody handed you your clients. Nobody handed you your work ethic. But the capital was there if you'd needed it. You never needed it." Something crossed his face that wasn't quite the thing I was looking for. I was hoping for understanding. What I saw first was something more defensive, a scrambling to preserve the story. "You let me think. I let you be exactly who you were." He looked at his hands. Fletcher cleared his throat. "I think," Fletcher said carefully, "that this is a family conversation and I should—" "No," Timothy said, "stay." And then, after a moment, softer, "Please," Fletcher stayed. Nadine finally spoke. Her voice was not what I expected. "I told Timothy we should have you stay with us tonight," she said, "before we left for the dinner. I said it felt wrong to just have you come to the restaurant without." She stopped, began again. "He said you'd prefer the hotel, that you liked your independence." She looked at Timothy. "That wasn't the real reason, was it?" Timothy said nothing. That silence was its own answer. I watched my son sitting at a table inside his own complicated shame. I have watched this boy, my boy, navigate the world for 40 years. I have watched him learn to read, and crash a bicycle, and grieve his father, and build something real out of his own effort and intelligence. I have also watched him learn, slowly and in small increments, to be ashamed of everything that came before the success. Not a sudden change, it never is. It builds in small humiliations accepted, small distances allowed, small corrections made to the official story. By the time cruelty arrives, it usually feels like just another adjustment. "Why did you ask me to come tonight?" I said. "If not to see me." He looked up, didn't answer immediately. "Timothy, because Duplantis mentioned family values," he said quietly. "In our last meeting, she said she prefers doing business with people who have," she used the word groundedness. "And I thought," he closed his eyes, "I thought having you there would make me look grounded," I said. "Yes." The word sat on the table between us. Nadine made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Fletcher was very still. I said very quietly, "I took a bus, Timothy. I wore a dress I've had for 9 years. I resoled my shoes so they'd look presentable, and I left my hair appointment late because I wanted to be on time for you." I paused. "And then you asked me to move to the bar because I knocked over a glass." The color came back into his face, except now it was the wrong kind. Mum, I'm not saying this for an apology, I said. I'm saying it because I want you to know that I know. I looked at him steadily. I've known for a long time, I've just been hoping I was wrong. Silence again. The rain was still visible through the windows, sliding down the glass in long, clean lines. Hugh, who knows when to speak and when not to, stayed quiet. It was Poppy who finally broke it, not literally, not in the room, but in my mind. I kept thinking of her on the phone. Don't let them make you feel small, Gran. 9 years old. Already paying better attention than the adults. She asked me that, I said. Not entirely to anyone. Who? Said Timothy. Poppy, before I came. I looked at him. She told me not to let them make me feel small. 9 years old. Something happened to Timothy's face that I don't have an exact word for. His jaw shifted. His eyes went bright and then immediately flat, the way eyes do when someone is fighting themselves and losing. He looked at the table. Fletcher beside him said very quietly, Tim. Timothy didn't look up. Tim, Fletcher said again. She came on a bus. A pause that stretched long enough that I was uncertain what would fill it. Then Timothy put both his hands over his face, and for a long moment he did not move, and the room held very still. And I heard my son cry for the first time since his father's funeral. Not theatrical crying. Not apologetic crying. The kind that comes when something you've been holding for a very long time finally gets too heavy to carry upright. I didn't move right away. I have learned, in 64 years, that rushing to comfort can sometimes interrupt what needs to happen first. So I waited. I looked at the rain. I thought about Bernard and his portfolio of quiet decisions. And his particular faith that things would work themselves out, if you gave them enough time, and arranged the conditions carefully enough. Then I got up, walked around the table, and put my hand on my son's shoulder. He reached up and grabbed it without looking. Fletcher quietly stood and moved to the far end of the room. Nadine, to her credit, did not leave. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the window and said nothing, which was, I think, the right thing. Hugh closed his portfolio. After a while, Timothy lowered his hands. His face was red and his eyes were swollen, and he looked 10 years younger and 10 years older at the same time. I don't know when I became that person, he said. Slowly, I said. The way most things happen. He shook his head. That doesn't excuse it. No, I agreed, it doesn't. What happens now? He looked at Hugh, then back at me. With the trust, with the restaurant, with all of it. That depends on you, I said. He frowned. On me. Your father built those structures to protect the family, not to punish it. Nothing gets taken away tonight. I looked at him carefully. But things do need to change. Hugh, from the far side of the table, added mildly. The Emberton Group Board will expect a conversation with your firm at some point, given the relationships involved. That will be professionally appropriate and professionally handled. Timothy closed his eyes briefly. And the clients downstairs. Fletcher will go down, I said. Not a question. I looked at Fletcher, who nodded once. Tell them there was a family matter that needed attending to, Fletcher said easily, as if he'd been waiting for the assignment, which is exactly true. Nadine looked at me then, really, looked at me, perhaps for the first time all evening. I owe you an apology, she said. Her voice was careful and private, not performed, which I appreciated. She paused. I've made assumptions about you that were unkind, and I've let Timothy make choices I should have pushed back on. She paused again. Tonight wasn't the first time. I know, I said. She nodded slowly. I know you know. It wasn't reconciliation. Not yet. Reconciliation takes time, and it takes the kind of repetition that can't happen in one conversation in a restaurant during a rainstorm. But it was honest. And honest is the necessary beginning. I left Toronto the next morning on the early bus. Timothy drove me to the station, just the two of us in the car before dawn, the city still mostly quiet. He carried my bag. He stood at the door of the terminal for an extra moment before letting me go. Mum, he said. I knows, I said, because I did. He nodded. Then, Poppy wants to come to Dartmouth this summer. She can come whenever she likes. She knows that. I know. He shifted the strap of my bag on his shoulder, then handed it to me. I'd like to come too. I looked at my son in the pale early light, with his expensive coat and his red eyes and his father's jaw, and I thought about the boy who used to save the last biscuit for me every time without being asked. You're always welcome, I said. That hasn't changed. And that was true. It has always been true. The fact that something hasn't been earned doesn't make it less offered. It just means the offering requires more faith. I got on the bus. I found a window seat. As we pulled out of the terminal and into the gray March morning, I reached into my coat pocket and found the worn edge of a photograph I keep there. Bernard and me at Timothy's graduation, arms around each other, both of us squinting into the sun. We looked tired in that photo. We'd been up since 4 that morning because the car wouldn't start, and we had to borrow Bernard's cousin's truck. But we look happy in a way that doesn't require explanation. I held the photo in my lap for the first few hours of the drive home. The rain had cleared overnight. By the time we crossed into Nova Scotia, the sky was beginning to go, that particular shade of pale gold that only happens in the early spring, when the light hasn't fully committed yet, but you can tell it's thinking about it. I looked out at that light and thought about Bernard, about the fact that he knew something would happen someday that would require this arrangement, and that he'd prepared for it without telling me, because he trusted that I would know when. He was right. He was usually right, in the way that quiet people often are. They spend less time talking and more time paying attention, and the attention accumulates into something that looks, eventually, like wisdom. I thought about Timothy crying into his hands, at a table inside a restaurant that, technically, I owned a considerable piece of. I thought about how little satisfaction I'd felt in that moment, how much more I'd felt holding his shoulder. I thought about Poppy saying, "Don't let them make you feel small," and the way she'd whispered it, like a warning and a prayer at the same time. 9 years old. Already understanding something, it took her father 4 decades and a reckoning to approach. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window and watched Nova Scotia coming toward me, the rocks and the dark water and the pale gold sky, and I thought, I am going home. Not to an easy life, not to a resolved life, but to a real one. To the cracked teapot, and the dog on the next street, and the literacy program on Tuesday mornings, and the food bank on Thursdays. To the photograph on the mastils and the chair by the window. And the slow particular work of keeping your life meaningful in the absence of the person who made it feel most worth keeping. And sometimes, if you've arranged things carefully enough, the way Bernard always arranged things, you get to be the kind of quiet that surprises people. The kind they didn't see coming. The kind that has been there all along in the background, holding everything steady while no one was looking. That's what Bernard always said love was in the end. Not the grand gesture, not the announcement, just the steady hand.